Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series I'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's video, we're going to show you guys how to paint up a band of Blissbarb archers for your games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. These are a unit from the Hidden Knights of Slaanesh, which is a chaos unit from Age of Sigmar. And as you can see in this picture, this is what the end result will look like. And by following the tips and techniques and tricks that we recommend, we could also help you save $194.38 in total on the paint job by using some really cheap craft paints. So that being said, let's go get this video on a roll and show you guys how to paint quickly and, more importantly, cheaply paint up your Blissbarb archers for your games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So the first step you need to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures. Now, as you can see in this photo, my miniatures look a little bit different than most normal Blissbarb archers, and the reason why is because I got these guys secondhand. I got these from my local player at my local gaming store. I guess he was originally going to get into Hidden Knights of Slaanesh, but I guess he decided he wanted to get out of it. So I purchased these miniatures from him, and he had a lot of missing pieces on these miniatures as well. And that perfectly worked out just fine for me, and the reason why is because I plan on converting these miniatures not to use for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, but rather use for a Mordheim campaign that we have going on my channel. So because of that, if you notice, a couple of these fighters actually have close combat weapons instead of actual bow and arrows, and the reason why that's the case is because I converted them over for them to be members, to be brethren, for members from the possessed warband, and that's exactly how we plan on using these guys in our campaign. So what do you need to do? Go and assemble your miniatures as you need to, and then from there we're ready to move on to our basing. So on the basing and the texturing on this one, I did something a little bit different this time around, and I decided to use some milliput. Milliput is a really cheap clay alternative that you can get at your local Walmart. I think it costs about $5.99. And I used some milliput real quick to make some really interesting looking kind of boulders and rocks to put on the bases as well. And the reason why I did that is because these Blissbarb archers, a lot of these guys are standing on what look like masonry and ruins of old temples and old structures from ancient times, and I wanted to carry that same motif through several of my other miniatures. So I just kind of made some really quick, simple like little boulders using milliput in order to do that. And then of course I did my typical wood glue and sand method. I then painted the bases with the parts that I want to have texturing on with wood glue, and I dusted that with sand. Once I let that sand dry, I then added a wash, which consisted of a mixture of both wood glue as well as water in a 50-50 mixture, and I applied it like a wash all over the entirety of the texturing, so that way when it dried, it creates an airtight seal, so that way the texture doesn't flake off the bases. And once you're done with that, we're ready to move on to priming our miniatures. So as you can see here, I decided to prime my miniatures. I used this can of Rust-Oleum flat white primer. You can get this at your local Walmart. I used it once over the entirety of the miniature. Now priming does a couple of things. The first thing that priming does is that it allows for your acrylic paints to adhere to your miniature. Unfortunately, if you were just to take regular acrylics and apply it to bare plastic, there's not enough surface tension in order to keep the acrylic paints attached to your miniature, so the slightest bit of friction will cause the paint to rub off your miniature and of course ruin the overall finish of your miniature. So priming does that in order to solve that problem. Another thing that priming also does too is it actually has a large impact on the value of the colors that you have on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the more brighter or the more bold paint job you want on your miniatures, the brighter the primer you should go. Whereas the more subdued or metallic you want to go with, you go the darker primer. Now for these miniatures, because I plan on using like an oil wash in order to darken down the value of these miniatures later on, I decided to go with a flat white primer, so that way it gives you a good solid base coat for me to work on the miniatures and to apply the paint to them. And once you're done with their primer, next thing you gotta do of course is start working on the flesh tones. So, to be perfectly honest, there's a lot of flesh that's exposed on these miniatures because, for one, they are Slaanesh miniatures, so of course, the Lord of Excess is going to have most of his fighters running around half naked most of the time. So because there is a lot of flesh that's exposed on these miniatures, and actually it makes the largest part of these miniatures as well. And I wanted to divide up these fighters into a variety of skin tones. So what I decided to do is break up into basically into small groups of 4 different skin tones. I use Peaches and Cream by Delta Cerancoat. I get this at my local Walmart for my really pale colored looking fighters. I then used Flesh by Apple Barrel Paint for about 5 of these fighters. I picked Nutmeg Brown for 3 of these fighters for a little bit more of a darker skin tone, and for the darkest skin tone I used Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel Paint. Now, the Apple Barrel paints you can get at your local Walmart as well. So I just put 2 thin layers directly on all the exposed flesh that's exposed on these fighters, which is quite a lot on these guys. So just go ahead and find those details and pick those out. You don't need to be entirely too neat at this point, because if you do make any mistakes, it's not a big deal. We can paint over it at a later time. So now that we have a good solid base coat on the flesh, what we need to do now is do a dry brush real quick to pick up a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. Now, dry brushing is an important step because what it does, it actually creates the illusion of depth in your miniatures, because the pigments, the paint, adhere to the raised surface of the miniature with a lighter color, while the darker base coat color stays in the recesses. It creates a lot of highlights and details by doing this. Now, for my fighters on the far right hand side that I use with Delta Cerancoat Peaches and Cream, I decided to dust those guys in a light dry brushing of Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. For the ones that I did in Apple Barrel Flesh for the base coat, I dry brushed them with Delta Cerancoat's Peaches and Cream. For the fighters that I base coated in Apple Barrel Nutmeg, I dry brushed them with Flesh by Apple Barrel. And then lastly, for the fighters I did in Burnt Umber, I dry brushed their flesh with Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint as well. And just once you get it done, a little quick over with your dry brushing, you're ready to move on. Now, I will admit that when you do the dry brushing like this, it's going to have like this kind of chalky, kind of pastel appearance. If you do notice that, don't stress out. As part of the dry brushing process, when we get to the oil washing stage, it's going to smooth out when we get to the oil wash, so don't worry about that. So the next major detail we're painting on these guys are on their leather goods. So I will warn you right now, this part of the painting process was the most difficult for me. The reason why is because these Hedonites of these Blissbarb archers, they have a bunch of like straps and things all over their bodies. They have belts and buckles and like necklaces and things. So because that's really annoying, because not only do you have to paint the actual flat surfaces of those straps and belts, but also the sides of it that touches the flesh of the characters. If you make the slightest mistake, it could go directly into your flesh tone. You have to go back and fix that real quick. So if you're not a fan of painting like stripy kind of straps and belts on miniatures, this kit would be an absolute nightmare. Not only that, I also focus on things like the bow and arrows these characters are using. So like, for example, the shaft of the arrows, as well as the bows themselves, as well as the grips and the handles of their weapons, as well as some of their boots. In order to pick out these leather details, I put 2 thin layers of pigment by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's a very dark gray, almost black, but the reason why I like using pigment paint is because there's a little bit of a grit to the texture of the paint. So when you do dry brushing, it does a beautiful job of actually creating that dry brushing effect on your miniatures. So be kind to yourself, take time, pick out all those details in pigment paint, and you're ready to move on to your dry brushing. Now, in order to accentuate the details that we saw earlier with the dry brushing that we did in pigment paint, I decided to dry brush them in pewter gray by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart as well. Just a quick dry brushing on all the leather goods, as well as all the weapon grips and the weapons themselves that we did earlier in pigment, to kind of create that little additional bit of highlighting on your dry brushing. And to neaten up that detail a little bit further, to bring a little bit more of those details, I do another dry brush with Folk Arts Pale Gray. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents as well. And I did a complete dry brushing over all of the gray surfaces that we did before. And as you can see, a lot of those details that we couldn't see before start popping up, like things like the studs that are located inside the leather, for example. So now that we have the leather goods finished, as well as the flesh tone, the next thing we need to do now is start working on the fabric of these miniatures. And I will warn you right now, there's not very much fabric on these guys. They mainly basically have shawls as well as loincloths for the most part. So because of that, in order to create some color variation within this warband, I decided to break it in half. I painted up 5 fighters with Lilac Mist by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. And for the darker purple, I used Purple Pansy by Apple Barrel Paint, and you can get this at your local Walmart as well. That way it creates a variety variety of different colors of purple within this warband, just to add a little bit more visual interest as well, because if I was just to pick one color, I think it would look a little too boring. So by mixing up these lighter and darker purples, it adds a lot of color variety in this warband. So now that we're done painting the fabric, the next thing I gotta do, of course, is to dry brush the fabric. And for this color, I use Princess Pink by Anita's Acrylic. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby. And it's a nice, beautiful kind of pastel kind of pink color. And I just did a quick dry brushing all the fabric that we did earlier. So regardless whether it was a dark purple or the light purple, I use exactly the same color in order to do the dry brushing. As you can see, it brings a lot of the details we couldn't see before, like the folds of the fabric and that sort of thing. So with most of the miniatures painted, we can now start focusing on the smaller details, and one of them, of course, is this little character here. I believe it's called a homunculi, I believe is what he's called. He's got this kind of brazier that he carries around full of skulls, as well as weird kind of, I don't know if it's narcotics or smoke or whatever. I mean, it could be anything. I mean, it's Slaanesh, for God's sake. So because of that, in order to create this kind of wispy, kind of smoky vibe, what I decided to do is actually paint up the entire brazier, as well as the fumes rising off of it, in 2 thin coats of Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. It's a nice pale turquoise color that also kind of contrasts quite nicely with all the purples, pinks, as well as fuchsias that we have in this warband, and I think it's a nice little color pairing, especially if we decide to do some glazing with some darker blue to kind of bring out those details from before. Another small detail that we also focus on these fighters are the number of skulls these characters are carrying on them. So these Blissbarb archers, they actually have some skulls strapped to their harnesses, either to their belts or in this case in the brazier right there that's carried by the little homunculi character. So in order to bring out that detail, we paint up the bow miniatures with 2 thin layers of light mocha by Appleboro paint. You can get it at your local Walmart. It contrasts quite nicely with the flesh tones that these characters already have, as well as the purples, as well as the pinks that their clothing consists of. So the next detail we start focusing on as well is on the hair of these fighters as well. Some of these characters actually have locks of braids on their head as well, so we decided to paint up those details real quick. For 2 fighters on the left hand side, I used Anita's Acrylic Moccasin Brown to bring out those locks for those characters. For the 2 in the center, I used Pewter Gray by Appleboro paint to create this nice little contrast with that darker gray color for 2 members of their fighters. And for 3 members of the warband who had hair, I also picked that out 2 thin layers of King's Gold by Appleboro paint as well to bring that nice yellow that contrasts nicely against that purple color. And the next small detail we also worked on was actually glazing the smoke vapors from the little brazier that little homunculi character is carrying. And the reason why I decided to use a glazing method is because what it does, it actually kind of acts like a wash. So it allows that lighter turquoise color to bleed through, but at the same time create some shadow as well as some shade. Now to create that glazing technique, what I decided to use was Appleboro's Bright Blue. I made a 50-50 mixture of mixing bright blue with some water, and I basically made it into a wash, and I applied it like a wash directly onto the brazier. Now what this does, of course, as you can see in this picture, it actually darkens down that turquoise a little bit, but more importantly, it creates that darker color in the recesses of the miniature. Now you do have to apply multiple coats of glazing in order to achieve this effect, to kind of create this kind of glowing ethereal look to it. So in this instance, I actually had to put 3 layers of glazing directly on it. So my suggestion to you is, as you are doing the painting process, put your first layer of glaze on that brazier, paint up your miniatures, whatever step you're on, come back to it, apply a 2nd layer, go back to painting your miniatures, and then return back to a 3rd layer, so that way by the time you get done with it, it's all dried and ready to go. So the next thing we're going to work on real quick is on the metallic elements on these miniatures, and the reason why I decided to work on the metallic elements is because that way those little headdress that these characters are wearing with these like kind of tassels attached to their headdresses, it was kind of like intricately built into their headgear, so I thought if I did the middle first and then paint those tassels, it'd be a much easier time, so I decided to actually go ahead and start working on the metallics. Traditionally, I like to keep the metallics into the very last step of my painting process, and the reason why is because changing out the water. If you use metallic paints earlier in your painting process and you don't change out the water, the metallic flecks that are inside the metallic paints inside of your rinse water could apply to the rest of your paint job, so look, have this kind of like sparkly kind of My Little Pony look going on with your paint scheme. So usually you want to keep the painting process from your metallics to the very last step. However though, I decided to kind of jump the gun a little bit just because I thought it would be easier time to paint the metallics instead of going to the tassels on the top of their headdresses. So I used 4 main colors for these characters. So the first color I used was Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. I did this for all the silver metallic elements on these characters. So like for example, the blades of their weapons, for example, the chains that these characters are carrying, the tips of their arrows. etc. Another detail I also used as well was Folk Art's anniversary silver. So I did these things for like jewelry that some of these characters are wearing to make it look like extremely bright, to add a little bit more highlight to that. I also used Deco Art's Emperor's Gold, which is a beautiful rich gold color that's very similar to Retributor armor, but a fraction of the price. And that's the color I primarily use throughout most of these fighters. So things like their headdresses, for example, pieces of iconography they're wearing, jewelry, bits of armor, that kind of detail I picked out. And those 2 thin layers of that Emperor's Gold. And then lastly, the glass color I use, of course, is Folk Art's Copper. So I did things for more, so things like the quivers of their bows, for example, some of the headdresses, as well as the jewelry these characters are wearing, the bowl of the brazier carried by the little homunculi, for example. So what you do is you add those color varieties of different metallics, and it brings up a lot of those details that you really couldn't see before. And speaking of details, the next thing we need to work on now are on the feathers of the arrows, as well as the tassels that they have on their headdresses as well. And once again, I decided to kind of break up the color scheme a little bit when it came to these characters' gear. So what I decided to do is, for the tassels that are coming off their headgear, I decided to pick down 2 thin layers of Tuscan teal. It's a nice dark Tuscan teal kind of color. I use that for the tassels of the headdresses. I also use it on the feathers of their bows from their quivers in order to create that detail. And the other detail I also focus on the gemstones that these characters are wearing as well. Now for those gemstone details, I picked out 2 thin layers of green turquoise by Apple Barrel paint as well. Just put a little single dot on all these gems that are all over their bodies. The reason why I chose that green turquoise is because it contrasts quite nicely with all the purples and pinks that these characters are wearing, and at the same time also contrasts quite nicely with all the gold elements that these characters are wearing as well. For example, if you look on the headdresses these guys wear, they have like a little jewel on their forehead, so I just picked out details like that with that green turquoise. And because we worked on those tassels, those feathers earlier, I just did a quick dry brushing real quick to bring out the texturing of those tassels so you can see the individual strands of hair, as well as the texturing of the fletching on the arrows and their quivers. And I dusted that real quick with some Folk Art's Dutch Aqua to kind of create that illusion of some depth on those details. So for the miniatures themselves, we're actually done. So now that we're done with the miniatures themselves, the next thing we're going to work on is on the bases that these characters are standing on. And like I said before, a lot of these characters are standing on what looks like to be ruined masonry, as well as old ruins of ancient buildings. So to pick out that detail on those bases, I picked out 2 thin layers of Skyline by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart. And I decided to use that because it's a nice dark grayish blue kind of color that contrasts nicely with what the characters are currently wearing. At the same time, it also kind of matches some of the Warcry terrain that I have in the studio's collection, as well as some of the Mordheim terrain that we're also planning on using these fighters for. And the next texture we're going to go with is to actually paste the actual texturing that's on the bases. Now you'll notice it's a bright purple color. I use Concord Grape by Apple Barrel paint for this. Now the reason why I use that color is because this is a Slaanesh warband, and if you guys ever see my studio's collection of Slaanesh miniatures, I actually have this purplish grayish texturing for the bases of my Slaanesh army, for my Legion of Slaanesh army in the studio's collection. And the reason why is because in my mind that's what Slaanesh's little palace would look like in the warp, with like this purplish grayish kind of terrain that these characters walk in. I mean, it's my headspace, so that's what I basically imagine in my head. So I decided to paint the sand that we did earlier on the bases in 2 thin layers of Concord Grape. Now if you do notice, some of the white detail does kind of bleed through a little bit with that purple paint, but if it does, don't worry, because we're going to dry brush these bases with some pale gray anyway, so just going to add to the dry brushing. And speaking of dry brushing, that's exactly what we did. I actually dry brushed the entirety of the bases with Pale Gray by Folk Art. This is both for the sand as well as for the masonry these characters are standing on. The reason why is because I want to create that contrasting look, and plus when I add the oil wash to it anyways, it's going to do a beautiful job of bringing out those details and that texturing. And speaking of oil washes, our next major step is to actually apply an oil wash all over the miniatures. Now for a quick paint method like this, a lot of painters like to use Army Painter Strong Tone, and that's a wonderful product. It does a beautiful job. It does exactly what it does as it advertises. The only problem with Army Painter Strong Tone though is that it's quite expensive at $32.99 per can. So in order to avoid that high cost but to achieve similar results, I like to use Minwax Polyacrylic and Mission Oak. You can get this at your local Walmart, and it's basically a combination of both a wood stain as well as a polyurethane. Now what they do is they basically apply this like an oil wash all over the entire of the miniatures, and it does a couple of things. The first thing the oil wash actually does is that it seeps directly into the recesses of the miniature, bringing a lot of the details and textures that we couldn't see before. So like the individual grains of sand within the base, for example, the folds within their fabric, the individual strands of hair within their headdresses, the musculature of their bodies, etc. The second thing it also does as well is it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushes as well as our base coats. As you guys can see here in this photo, those to pastel kind of chalky appearance is now gone because it's blended those two transitions seamlessly and kind of makes it look more organic. The last thing that the oil wash also does as well as it darkens down the value of our miniatures as well in terms of the color. So you can see they're not as brightly colored as before, and that's the reason why I use such bright colors in the very beginning processes of this paint scheme. And the reason why is because I knew that the oil wash is going to darken it down, and that's the reason why I use such bright colors in the first place. Now when you do the oil wash, you do have to let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours because there is a polyurethane in it. What that polyurethane dries and cures, what's going to do is going to create a hard outer coating that's going to protect your paint job from fading as well as from chipping. It does also give it a high gloss finish as well, so do keep that in mind when you have this. My recommendation for you is to make this the last step of your painting process from whenever you paint. Once you're done, let it dry and cure and return back to the next time that you actually finish up your paint job. Alright, the very last thing we're going to do for our very last detail is to rim the bases of our miniatures, and for this I like to use pewter gray by Folk Art. I just put 2 thin layers of the pewter gray directly around the rim of the bases. It does a nice job of blending seamlessly with the purples as well as the skyline we have earlier. And at the same time, this is also exact same basing method I use for the entire Slaanesh army in our Studios collection for our Legion Slaanesh for Warhammer Fantasy. So that way if I want to, I can use these fighters for Warhammer Fantasy as well as Mordheim, as well as for Age of Sigmar, or for whatever else I want to use it for. Now the very last step, of course, is completely optional. What I like to do is I like to use a matte varnish spray directly onto my miniatures. I use Krylon matte varnish in order to achieve that result. I get this stuff from my local Walmart. And the reason why I do that is because I don't like that high gloss sheen that's done with the polyurethane from the mid-wax polyacrylic. So I just do a quick once over real fast with some matte varnish to make it have a more subdued and matte finish. You can see a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. Now if you do like the high gloss finish, of course, then obviously skip this step because it's only optional. And with that matte varnish spray finish, this is exactly what our miniatures look like with the end result that we saw earlier. As you can see, we have these miniatures at a beautiful tabletop standard, and they look like to bring Wrath and Ruin onto the tabletop of Mordheim, Warhammer Age of Sigmar, Warcry, or for whatever else you want to use these miniatures for as well. They look really awesome at the same time. So now that we're done talking about exactly how we paint these miniatures up, let's go ahead and talk about the method that you'll need to purchase from both Army Painter and Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. So in order to paint your miniatures the exact same way we did, but using Army Painter Citadel products instead, this is the list of materials that you'll need. You need to buy a can of Corex white spray for $17, followed by the colors Thunderhawk blue, Wraithbone, Baneblade brown, Evelyn sunset, Genestealer purple, Takala lilac, Teclis blue, Bugman's grill, Cadian flesh tone, Baylor brown, Slaanesh gray, Eshin gray, Flayed One fresh, Fulgrim pink, XV88, Rust gray, and Ulthuan gray, and all those colors would cost you $4.55 per pot. You also need to buy Pterodon turquoise, Wildwood, Leviathan purple, Astrogranite for the basing, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Iron Breaker, Aethermatic blue, as well as Retributor armor, and all those pounds of paint also cost $7.80 from Citadel. You need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone from Army Painter, which would cost you $32. You need to buy a can of Minotaurian Varnish from Games Workshop for $19.50. And if you decide to use the basing set for Army Painter, you'll need to use the Army Painter basing set, which costs you $18.99. So, assuming that you're purchasing everything from Army Painter as well as Citadel for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $235.04 in order to paint up your miniatures. And when you compare it to our cheapskate method, which only costs $40.66, you have a grand total savings of $194.38 being saved. So if you're looking for a way to save some money on your miniature wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching your paint over to cheap craft paints. After all, you can achieve very similar results on a fraction of the cost, and it's an easy way for you to save money instead of buying some name brand paints. After all, you can use the savings from your craft paints in order to purchase more miniatures, and let's be honest, there's a choice between choosing paint or miniatures. Most of us are using miniatures. So there you guys have it. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all this greatest hobby news related to this channel. I am Kim out of Cheapskate. That's good for this one. I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace out and stay classy.